Hi, everyone. Welcome to the lecture on health as self-fulfillment by Michael Boylan. So, in this lecture, I want to cover a little bit about and explain a little bit about some of the main points of the article. Again, the central objective here is what is health? How do we define health? And we have different sort of lenses. Boylan is going to try to argue for one, I think, one sort of one perspective as uh, the one that seems to be the best one to use for conceiving health. But I think that I think a more holistic view might be the most appropriate way of looking at this. But let's see how how he divides this up. So the best way to understand it is to think of it in terms of three uh, three different ways, right? So the first one is the kind of functional approach. Okay. The second one is what he calls the public health approach. And then the last one is the subjectivist approach. So those are the three main categories. The first one, again, is the functional category or approach to health. Second one is the public health approach. And then the third one is the subjectivist. So within those categories, we have subcategories. Okay, so don't get confused. The article's a little bit confusing. So, but those are the three main categories, and then within those three main ones, we have different ones. So, for instance, the first category, which is the functional approach to health, he talks about the biostatistical theory, the objectivism, and functionalism as three different approaches within functionalism. Okay, so I'm going to try to summarize this instead of going into too much detail of the specifics. The main idea, okay, is that what the functionalism focuses on is in trying to be super scientific. So what that means is that he calls it value-free health conception, a conception of health that doesn't invoke certain values as what is good and bad. It just tells you what the health of the person is, like very objectively. Okay, so that entails functionalism, and it entails objectivism, obviously, and it entails also what he calls the biostatistical theory. All of these have a problem, and that is that the separation of facts and value is a dead enterprise. Okay, this is something that, as he explains in the article, goes back to the logical positivist. You don't have to worry about this. These are philosophical movements of the 20th century. The main idea was that there is no place in science and scientific investigations for human values. That is completely so. So the idea is separation of fact and values, right? Values is one thing, facts are another. But I think that that is a dead enterprise. And one of his arguments is, look, I mean, facts are, that kind of objectivism. That's fine, but to think that is not imbued already with value, the way you ask the question, the way you approach the topic is already in some ways infected with our interest, our intentionality, what we want to know. So there is a sense in which he thinks it's impossible, right, to separate value from fact, right? So these doesn't mean that biostatistics of a human organism and the functioning of the human organism aren't valuable. They are important statistics for us to determine the health, right? But we need more than that. Okay, that's the key, right? So, and the idea that we can't inject value into the conception of health is just wrong, right? So that's the first one. The second approach is the public health approach, and then again, we have here the same problem. He calls it the thin and the thick conceptions of public health. Again, remember, the difference between health and public health is that health deals with individuals. Doctors and clinical medicine deals with individuals. You go to the doctor and the doctor says, what is the problem? And you say, well, I'm just coming for a certain test, my checkup, and then he says, what is your age? What, gives you all these questions about you, and asks all these questions about you, then does an exam on you, and then tells you about your individual health. Public health does not deal with individuals. It deals with groups of people. It investigates how a certain group within a certain maybe ethnicity or age range or nation, or state, country, whatever, how that group is doing in a certain reference, right? Whether with respect to, I don't know, with respect to certain disease or in general health, right? Heart failures or something like that. So it investigates the group, right? And it comes up with solutions for group health, okay? Now, when I think about health of a group, I can think again within the sort of narrow, objectivist, value-free conception, which he calls the thin perspective, of just looking at the statistics of the group, right? So I just want the medical facts. What are the statistics of the groups? When I think about health of a group, I can also think about it in a different way, in what he calls a thick way, a broader way, right? A more open way, in which I not only think about the statistics, that's important, but I also want to think about these social arrangements and social conditions of the group. Do they live in a dictatorship? What is their political situation? What is their environmental situation? What are the social aspects of their situation? Is there discrimination? Is there, are we talking about a minority group within a certain, is it an exploited group? Is it an oppressed group? So all of that is part of health. It affects health, right? If you're an exploited or oppressed group, minority group within a certain nation, that's going to affect, it's not just your blood pressure, that's going to affect your overall health, right? The way your well-being. So I'm thinking of health in a kind of broader context. How is your well-being, right? So again, public health deals with group health, and it has two perspectives, the thin and the thick. Now, the subjectivist takes on this kind of thick aspect of thinking about health. So I want to think about the well-being of the person, right? That's why it's subjective, So I need to know, how are you doing? The doctor might say, how are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you feeling? Well, I've had a lot of anxiety lately. I have a lot of stress at work. And, I'm going through a divorce, and my children, I was diagnosed with a certain problem, and, my mother has a lot of issues, so that's causing a lot of problems in our family. Whatever it is, that these are psychological, social dimensions to your health, and they're subjective, right? Because they're affecting you in a certain way. So when I think about health, I can think of it not just about, what is your blood work, but rather more of a holistic view about what is your situation in general in your social, personal, family, employment. I have a boss who who hates me and causes a lot of stress and anxiety in my life. So these things affect your health. And so that is the subjectivist approach. Now, he's going to argue that for a position within the subjectivist approach, but there are different, different also perspectives within the subjectivist. For instance, we have the desire fulfillment theory of well-being. So the fact is, I have certain desires. I want to retire when I'm 60, and I can't retire until I'm 75. That could affect my well-being. So I have desires. I wanted to go on a vacation, but I haven't been able to go on a vacation for 4 years. So, I wanted to change careers, but I can't. I wanted to, I don't know. You get my point. So the subjectivist approach of well-being and health that takes into consideration your desires, if you can meet those desires, you're healthy. I wanted to be able to run a marathon, but I can't. I wanted to be able to do more bike riding, but I can't because my knees are bad. So there is some sense in which there's a connection between my fulfilling my desires and my health, my overall well-being. If I think of health as well-being, right? So again, if on the other hand you fulfill all your desires according to this view, then you're very healthy, right? Because you have accomplished all the things that you want. Now, the problem with this, I think you might already know what the problem is, which is you might really have bad desires. I really wanted to smoke a pack of cigarettes every day, but I can only smoke 15. So it kind of assumes that your desires are good ones. I think, that this is problematic, right? The idea that just satisfying desires in some way will make you healthy almost seems absurd to some extent. So the next one is objective list theory of well-being. So we can't depend on your own personal subjective desires to calculate health, because that seems absurd, right? Because you could just have really bad desires. So what we need is an objective list, right, from doctors, right? You should want this to smoke no cigarettes. You should want this to drink very little. Should want to run 3 miles a day. You should want this. You should want that. So a list, but from an outside exterior objective source, not from your own desires. And then the accomplishment of that list, okay, should in some way meet the standard of health. Okay, so that is another conception. Okay, again, this I think has its own problems, right? I mean, there is a sense in which imposing upon someone desires that they don't have seems absurd, right? Because the whole idea of a desire is that one wants it, right? So they certainly can't be desires. And if they're not your desires, if they're not something you want, then it seems absurd to think about fulfillment unless, it comes after you do these things. Oh, now that I do them, I want to do them, and I feel good about doing them, or something like that. But that is a big leap in our assumptions that certain things like that would happen, right? So, Boylan is going to argue for a different theory, and his last theory he's going to call this idea of self-fulfillment, where he introduces his conception of worldview. Now, so he wants to talk about fulfillment in a sense in which Aristotle talks about eudaimonia. This is a little bit strange, I think, and I think Boylan kind of mixes up things here, but our task is to interpret the text, okay? And so I want to do that. I'm going to tell you what Boylan thinks and what he says and what he means. And whether or not he's right, that's a different question. So what Boylan wants to say is like, okay, the desire account, no. The objectivist account, no. I want to argue for a kind of, it's sort of a desire, but a desire that is good. So it's kind of within the subjectivist approach, it's kind of like what we should strive for is eudaimonia. And eudaimonia for Aristotle is a fulfilling good life in accordance with our nature. What is a good life in accordance with our nature? A life that is very reasonable, rational, okay, that uses reason to, if you remember virtue ethics, that uses reason to make decisions, okay? That is the rational life. And he presents two competing worldviews that we can adopt, okay? One is the competitive worldview, and there he talks about the hunting metaphor. He talks about the Thomas Hobbes' state of nature, and he talks about Nietzsche's will to power. So the idea of the hunting metaphor and the state of nature and Nietzsche's will to power, all of that describes what he calls the competitive sort of worldview. The worldview where we compete, right? And it's a zero-sum game. In other words, if I win, he uses the analogy of the game that children play when there's music, the chairs, and the music stops. You'd have to take a chair, but of course there's always one chair less than there are people, so somebody's always excluded, right? So the idea is that the competitive worldview is inherently exclusivist, right? Insofar as there will be ultimate losers here, okay? Who lose significantly, okay? Now, the cooperative worldview is very different. It is a worldview that in which it's inclusive, inherently inclusive. The idea is that we cooperate with one another. And this, he thinks, you see, is the idea of having a goodwill towards others and lifting everyone up. Okay, so, I mean, it sounds very idealistic, right? And the idea that these are mutually exclusive to me sounds a little bit far-fetched, because I just find that I don't see why we can't have a system in which competition, in which there is a kind of friendly competition, or a competition that is not zero-sum game, right? So I'm not sure that that he's completely right about this, but this is his this is what he says. So now he uses, for this cooperative worldview, he wants to argue that what we need to do is kind of assume this character building model. But see, I don't see why that model can't be used in, for instance, the competitive worldview. It seems completely consistent, right? So the character building model that he wants to kind of embed into his cooperative worldview is nothing but Aristotle's virtue ethics, right? The idea that we can create certain habits or dispositions that help us in our decision-making process in such a way that they always advances towards our good goals, the goal of cooperation and goodwill. Okay, so, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I just don't find it to be something that necessarily has to do with a cooperative worldview. It has to do with virtue ethics. Okay. Anyways, why is the worldview better one to define health? He thinks that he says that doctors have found, the health profession has found competition to be actually something that deteriorates health and produces different kinds of unhealthy results in individuals. Yeah, maybe. I mean, maybe there are different forms of competition, and certain forms of competition are very negative, but not necessarily all forms of competition, not for all kinds of people. Some people thrive and are healthy when they compete, right? In a friendly environment way, controlled, in which their life is not necessarily at stake, right? But certainly, fun competition, even competing with oneself, right? I want to beat my previous goal, doesn't seem to be necessarily a negative uh, health factor. But anyways, this is his argument. And the second thing he says is that the nature of the competitive worldview is a zero-sum game, while the cooperative worldview is not, and therefore, in the case of health, it would make no sense to employ such a worldview. Again, I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. I don't think that all competitive worldviews have to be zero-sum games, right? So you can have companies that compete against each other and then share their information at the end of the game, at the end of the time, at some point. So it is true that certain areas of healthcare, certainly cooperation is uh, the most paradigmatic sort of framework that will optimize results. There's no question about that. It doesn't mean that there are no other kinds of structures or domains within society in which competition would actually be a good thing. So I'm just a little worried about this sort of all or nothing kind of view. So uh, he argues again using Aristotle, I think, in many ways for this character building sort of model within his cooperative worldview. He argues for two virtues, two habits, or two dispositions or attitudes that are very important that should permeate all aspects of the decision making with respect to health. And one of these virtues is balance. Okay, he calls it balance. So moderation, keeping things balanced. The idea of balance in Aristotle, of course, is the idea of the mean. He talks about this actually. So for Aristotle, one should, all kinds of actions have extremes, right? Like to be courageous, my example I gave in the slide is to be courageous is the mean, the balance, the middle area between being a coward on one end and being rash or doing things that are a little bit extreme, running into a running in, if you have four people holding up, running in and fighting with the four people that have guns, right? That would be rash. So kind of knowing where that mean is very difficult, but knowing to avoid the extremes is what Aristotle would call balance. The second one is self-control. And here, he argues that self-control, for Aristotle, self-control is what Aristotle calls temperance. Okay, so the view that temperance is the view is the virtue that allows one to control one's passions, one's appetite. That ability is extremely important for Aristotle because a lot of times what doesn't allow us to accomplish our goals and to make the right decisions or to follow through, the idea of practicality, to follow through with our goals, is that we give in to our passions. We can't control our natural desires. And in conclusion, I will summarize his own summary of this in the article, which is that the cooperative world view process, he says, goes like this. One seeks balance to achieve self-control. So both of these are already in the first sort of idea, right? Self-control allows one to successfully carry out the personal worldview imperative. Why? Because you have discipline, self-control. You can control your emotions, you can control your appetites, and therefore you can make the right decisions. 3, a developed and rational and effective goodwill allows one to develop habits of excellence that are directed toward one's chosen life plan. That's 3. 4, a life plan chosen per above will be the most choice-worthy path toward an agent's goals, self-fulfillment. And 5, because the process begins with balance, this property continues through all of the steps as a property of the agent. 6, balance supports personal health. And 7, the choice-worthy path toward self-fulfillment supports personal health. I find this argument to be a little weak, but if we need to maybe reflect on this a little bit, and maybe you can discuss it, why you don't agree with it. I think that if again, we're assuming here that self-fulfillment, achieving one's goals, is actually a healthy thing, and that's not. I don't find that to be necessarily the case, right? I think health is something different than self-fulfillment. You may give up your health, for instance, for things you value more, your family, for instance, and you may be self-fulfilled to the extent that you are a good friend and a good father, a good mother, a good brother, a good sister, but very unhealthy. Okay, you may be satisfied with your life because you did the right thing, and morality maybe is inconsistent with health in some situations, right? In fact, you may have to give up your life, which is probably not very healthy. So a kind of altruistic, action could lead to one's own death. And this may be the right thing to do for you. And it might be very fulfilling in some ways, but it may cause extreme unhealthy situations. Could cause that you break a leg and that you never recover from that breaking of a leg, or whatever the case may be. It seems to me a little bit risky, I think, to equate the life of self-fulfillment as an ethical kind of fulfillment, as a moral self-fulfillment, with health. I don't think that health and self-fulfillment in the Aristotle way, in the Aristotelian way, eudaimonia, are necessarily converge in every single case, right? It can. There are things about virtue that can help you lead a healthy life, but they don't guarantee it, okay? Because their goal is something else. It's ethical, living a good life in the sense of the ethical life. And that's not necessarily the healthy life. So that is my critique and my problem with Boylan's view. So I hope that this made some sense. And please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact me or put them on the Google community. Thanks.